This story goes out to Mingfans Hung, 8927, for recommending Eyeless Jack. If there's a creepypasta that you would like for me to cover, feel free to let me know in the comments. Now let's get started. Jenny was not a morning person. She usually relied on the sound of her annoying alarm clock to drag her out of bed. This morning was different. There was no annoying beep, beep, beep. Instead, a chilling gust of wind brushed her face, causing her to wake up with a jolt. Blinking her eyes open, she realized her window was open. That was strange, she thought. She always kept it locked, but what really got her attention was the red splatter all over her window pane. She scrambled out of bed, heart pounding, and cautiously approached. To her horror, it wasn't paint. It was blood. The reality of it sent shivers down her spine. Had an animal been injured? Had someone played a terrible prank on her? Questions swirled in her mind as she quickly closed and locked the window, wiping away the blood with trembling hands. She decided not to tell her parents just yet. She didn't want to worry them if it turned out to be some kid's idea of a joke. That night, as Jenny tried to sleep, her room felt different, colder. She bundled herself up in her blankets and tried to brush away her fears. But as she began to drift off, a vivid dream took over. She was standing in the middle of a foggy forest. Everything was silent except for the sound of her own breathing. The mist around her felt cool and damp. But then, out of the fog, came a figure. It was too dark to see clearly, but two things stood out. The figure was wearing a hoodie and had no eyes, only deep, dark, empty sockets. They seemed to be looking right at her, if that were even possible. Jenny wanted to run, but her feet were glued to the spot. The eyeless figure took slow, deliberate steps toward her. She could hear its raspy breathing getting louder. Just as the figure was inches away from her, Jenny jolted awake, covered in sweat. She sat up, panting heavily. It was just a dream, she told herself. But as she tried to calm her racing heart, she couldn't help but glance nervously at her blood-splattered window. Weekends at Jenny's house usually meant chores. This Saturday was no different. Today's task, cleaning out the attic. As she rummaged through old boxes of family memorabilia, Jenny's fingers brushed against a leather-bound journal with worn edges. It was strangely out of place amidst the family photos and heirlooms. Curious, she dusted off its cover and cracked it open. The pages inside weren't like any ordinary journal. Instead of memories or thoughts, it contained disturbing sketches and scribbled notes. Each page was more unsettling than the last. There were drawings of shadowy figures, ancient symbols, and in the middle, a too familiar drawing of a hooded figure with hollow eye sockets. Underneath the drawing was a name, Eyeless Jack. The notes were in a frantic hand, recounting chilling tales of this Eyeless Jack. One entry read, "He comes from the shadows, driven by a hunger for eyes. Those he stalks are never seen again." Another said, "The signs are there, the blood, the cold, the feeling of being watched. He's close." Jenny's heart pounded as memories of the previous night flooded back. The blood on her window, the haunting dream. Could it be related? Suddenly she felt a cold draft, making the hair on the back of her neck stand up. An overwhelming sense of being watched consumed her. She quickly closed the journal and shoved it back into the box, trying to shake off the eerie feeling. She decided to bring the journal to her room for safekeeping. That evening, as darkness settled, she couldn't resist reading more. The stories of Eyeless Jack's relentless pursuit, his eerie presence in the shadows, and the disturbing rituals associated with him were both fascinating and horrifying. Jenny knew she needed to find out more. Maybe, just maybe, the answers to the mystery of the blood on her window were hidden within these pages. But as she prepared to dive deeper into the journal, she couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that she was no longer alone in her quest for answers. By Monday, Jenny tried to return to her normal routine, even though the chilling events from the weekend lingered in her mind. School was a welcome distraction, and she hoped her friends could provide some comfort. But when she shared the strange incidents with them, they laughed it off, thinking she was just trying to spook them with a made-up story. Walking home that evening, Jenny decided to take a shortcut through the park. The sun was setting, casting long, eerie shadows across the ground. Each rustling leaf and distant bird call made her jumpy, but she chided herself for letting her imagination run wild. That's when she heard it, a soft, shuffling sound behind her. She quickened her pace, trying to convince herself it was just the wind. But then the shuffling turned into distinct footsteps, growing louder and more persistent. Summoning her courage, Jenny turned around, half expecting to see a curious squirrel or a neighborhood cat. Instead, she was met with the haunting sight of a hooded figure. It was tall, shadowy, and those hollow, eyeless sockets stared right at her. It was Eyeless Jack. Frozen in fear, Jenny and the figure stood still for what felt like hours. But then, with a swift movement, Eyeless Jack lunged at her. Panic surged through Jenny. Her survival instincts kicked in, and she ran as fast as her legs would carry her. The park, which once felt familiar, now seemed like a twisting maze of trees and paths. Jack's footsteps echoed behind her, relentless and chilling. Just when Jenny thought she couldn't run any longer, she spotted her neighborhood's entrance up ahead. Mustering every ounce of strength, she sprinted to safety. She didn't stop until she reached her front door, bursting inside and locking it behind her. Panting and trembling, Jenny tried to process what just happened. She was no longer dealing with an old legend from a dusty journal. Eyeless Jack was real, and he was after her. That night, as she lay in bed, she realized that the safety of her home might only be temporary. This was just the beginning of a deadly game of cat and mouse. The days following her terrifying encounter in the park were a blur for Jenny. She was on high alert everywhere she went, constantly glancing over her shoulder and jumping at the smallest sounds. One morning, as she was getting ready for school, she noticed a disturbing message written in a reddish-brown hue on her bathroom mirror. "I see you." Jenny's heart raced. She quickly wiped it away, trying to convince herself it was some cruel joke. However, that wasn't the end. Everywhere she went, new messages would appear. On her school locker, there was a scratched symbol that looked eerily like the one she saw in the journal. In her textbooks, she'd find pages smeared with blood and the words, "Your eyes next," written across them. The world felt like it was closing in on her. One day, after a particularly grueling school day, she arrived home to find her room in disarray. Her belongings were strewn all over the place, but it was the blood-smeared message on her wall that stopped her cold. Soon, Jenny was no longer safe anywhere. She decided to confide in her best friend Emily. Together they tried to decipher the strange symbols and messages, hoping to find some clue to fend off Eyeless Jack. As the days passed, the situation grew grimmer. Some of Jenny's close friends began to distance themselves from her, thinking she was the one behind the creepy pranks. Worse, others disappeared for days, only to return with vacant stares and no memory of where they'd been. The only hint: their eyes appeared duller, almost lifeless. Amidst all the chaos, Jenny found solace in her bond with Emily, but even that was short-lived. One evening, as Jenny went over to Emily's house for a study session, she discovered her friend's front door ajar. Hesitantly, she entered, calling out Emily's name. No answer. As she moved further into the house, a chilling scene unfolded. The living room was covered in those familiar, sinister symbols, and in the center, on the coffee table, lay the journal. But the worst part: Emily was nowhere to be found. The weight of the situation pressed down on Jenny. She was trapped in a terrifying web of mystery and horror, and the spider at the center was none other than Eyeless Jack. Jenny was at her breaking point. With Emily missing and the ominous messages becoming more frequent, she felt like a cornered animal. She needed an escape, a place to clear her head and figure things out. So she decided to visit her grandparents' remote cabin for the weekend. The cabin, nestled deep within the woods, was always a sanctuary for Jenny. The fresh air, the serene surroundings, and the gentle hum of nature usually calmed her restless mind. But this time, the towering trees seemed like silent watchers, and the woods whispered secrets she couldn't decipher. On her first night there, her grandmother, noticing Jenny's distress, decided to share a story. As they sat by the fireplace, her voice soft but firm, she recounted a tale from her youth. To Jenny's shock, it was eerily similar to her own experiences. Decades ago, a shadowy figure with hollow eyes had stalked her grandmother. Many in the town had whispered of Eyeless Jack, but most thought it was just a scary story to tell around campfires. Yet for her grandmother, the terror was real. She spoke of close encounters, mysterious symbols, and friends who vanished only to return, changed. The climax of her tale came one fateful night when, armed with ancient chants and rituals gleaned from old books, her grandparents confronted this dark entity at the very cabin Jenny was now staying in. They believed they had sealed it away, cutting off its power, but there was something her grandmother hesitated to reveal. After some pressing, she finally admitted that the final step of the ritual required a sacrifice, not of life, but of memory. To truly bind the entity, they had to give up their most cherished memory. For her grandparents, it was the memory of their first meeting. Listening to her grandmother's story, a mixture of horror and hope filled Jenny. Perhaps there was a way to end this nightmare after all. She decided to delve deeper, to understand the rituals and perhaps find a way to stop Eyeless Jack once and for all. However, that very night, as a thick fog enveloped the cabin, Jenny spotted a familiar, menacing figure lurking outside. The peace of the cabin was shattered. Eyeless Jack was closer than ever, and the chase was far from over. With Eyeless Jack's presence casting a shadow over the cabin, Jenny knew she had to act fast. She decided to use the knowledge her grandmother shared to set a trap. The old books her grandmother had used were stored in the attic. Dusting off thick layers of age, Jenny pored through them, searching for the rituals. With each page, she learned more about Eyeless Jack's dark origins and his insatiable hunger for eyes, windows to the soul. Armed with her newfound knowledge, Jenny and her grandmother started preparing. They gathered various herbs, drew protective symbols around the cabin, and placed lit candles in a specific pattern. At the center of the cabin, they placed a mirror, for legend had it that seeing his own reflection would disorient Eyeless Jack, even if just for a moment. But the most crucial part of the trap was the bait. Jenny, knowing the risks, decided she would play this dangerous role. She would lure Jack into the cabin. Nightfall approached, and Jenny ventured out, her grandmother watching anxiously from the shadows. As expected, it didn't take long for the familiar shuffling sound to echo in the woods. The chase began anew. Dodging between trees and avoiding pitfalls, Jenny led Eyeless Jack on a harrowing chase, always staying just out of his grasp. As she neared the cabin, she could feel him closing in, his cold, haunting presence inches away. With a final burst of energy, Jenny rushed into the cabin with Jack hot on her heels. As he stepped onto the cabin's threshold, the candles flared brighter, and the symbols on the ground glowed an eerie blue. Caught off guard, Jack glanced at the mirror in the center of the room. The reflection he saw made him stumble back in confusion and rage. Jenny's grandmother quickly began chanting a binding ritual. Each word seemed to weigh heavily on Eyeless Jack, pushing him down. But the entity was not so easily defeated. Lashing out, he extinguished several candles, weakening the trap. With the ritual's power waning and Eyeless Jack regaining his strength, Jenny made a desperate decision. Remembering her grandmother's sacrifice, she closed her eyes and willingly gave up her most cherished memory. Her days with Emily, full of laughter and shared secrets. The room was filled with blinding light. When Jenny opened her eyes, Eyeless Jack was gone, leaving behind only the disturbed patterns of the ritual. The trap had worked, but at a steep cost. As Jenny looked around, she felt a void in her heart, a loss she couldn't fully remember. But with the danger behind her and the hope of safer days ahead, she held on to the belief that some sacrifices are worth the price. In the days following the trap, Jenny's life began to settle into a semblance of normalcy. The oppressive weight of Eyeless Jack's pursuit had lifted, but the price she had paid weighed heavily on her mind. Every time she tried to remember Emily, she encountered only fog and emptiness. One evening, as Jenny was cleaning the cabin, she found a small, blood-stained scrap of paper wedged beneath a wooden floorboard. Unfolding it, she recognized the hurried scrawl of Emily's handwriting. The note read, "Jenny, if you're reading this, I managed to get away, but not for long. He's always watching, waiting. I discovered something crucial. The ritual isn't the end. To truly defeat him, you need to confront the past. Remember what was taken and reclaim it. Only then can he truly be banished. Be careful and trust your heart. M." Jenny's heart raced. The forgotten memories of Emily, the shared laughter and their bond. They were not just personal sacrifices, they were the key to Eyeless Jack's true defeat. But how could she remember what was deliberately forgotten? Determined to find answers, Jenny revisited the attic's old books. Deep within their pages, she stumbled upon a ritual called the Reclamation of Memories. It was risky, involving a confrontation with one's own fears and traumas. With her grandmother's help, Jenny prepared for the ritual. The process was intense, with candles forming a circle around her and chants that echoed through the night. As she dove deeper into her own consciousness, she faced shadowy versions of her past, each more challenging than the last. Finally, she arrived at a familiar scene, a sunlit park where she and Emily laughed and played. Their joy was palpable, their bond unbreakable. As she approached Emily, Memories flooded back, filling the void in her heart. But this reunion was short-lived. The park started to darken, and the menacing form of Eyeless Jack emerged from the shadows. Only this time he looked weakened, his form less defined. Armed with her reclaimed memories and newfound strength, Jenny confronted him. They clashed, a fierce battle of wills. But with each memory Jenny recounted aloud, Eyeless Jack's form began to disintegrate until he was nothing more than a wisp of darkness, banished by the power of Jenny's undying bond with Emily. When Jenny woke from the ritual, she was surrounded by the warmth of the cabin and her relieved grandmother. Her memories of Emily were intact, and the looming threat of Eyeless Jack felt like a distant nightmare. But as the days turned into weeks, Jenny couldn't shake off a gnawing feeling. Had she truly defeated him? Or had she only pushed him back into the shadows, waiting for another chance to emerge? Only time would tell. With her memories restored and life seemingly returning to normal, Jenny felt an odd mix of relief and lingering anxiety. She had confronted Eyeless Jack in the realm of her memories and seemed to have defeated him. But the world felt different now. Shadows felt deeper and nights longer. One day, as she was walking home from school, a familiar spine-chilling breeze passed by. In a flash, Jenny remembered Emily's dire warnings from the blood-stained note. It wasn't over. That evening, as darkness crept in, the lights in Jenny's home started to flicker. The temperature dropped, and a heavy feeling of dread settled in. She could sense him. Eyeless Jack was close, and he wasn't alone. Distorted, ghostly forms of his previous victims, eyes hollow and souls trapped, floated around him. They were his army, and he'd come for Jenny. Mustering her courage and the knowledge she gained from the books, Jenny decided it was time for the final confrontation. She wouldn't hide or run, she would face him head-on. Setting up in her living room, Jenny began drawing protective symbols, lighting sage, and placing mirrors at strategic points. If reflections had disoriented him before, she hoped to amplify that effect. And then she waited. The first sign of the assault was a deep, resonating hum. The shadows of his victims emerged first, swirling around the house, searching for an entry point. But it was the heavy thud of Eyeless Jack's footsteps that truly terrified Jenny. He was here. As he entered the room, the mirrors reflected his grotesque, eyeless form from multiple angles, creating a disorienting maze of reflections. The trapped souls that followed him seemed confused, their forms flickering between rage and sadness. Jenny began chanting, her voice clear and resonant. The words weren't just to repel or trap, but to free. The trapped souls started regaining clarity, their forms stabilizing as the weight of Jack's influence weakened. With his army dissipating, Eyeless Jack lunged at Jenny. They grappled, his cold touch sending chills down her spine. But with every push, Jenny chanted louder, the room brightening. Suddenly, a beam of intense light shot out from one of the mirrors, catching Jack in its path. The energy from all his captured souls, now free and empowered, converged on him. With a deafening scream, Eyeless Jack was consumed by the light, finally banished. The aftermath was eerily calm. The room returned to its normal state, the weight lifted. Weeks turned into months, and Jenny's life truly returned to normal. But she was changed, no longer a mere survivor, but a guardian against the dark. She knew that there were other entities, other shadows, but with the knowledge and strength she had gained, she was ready. For now, though, all she wanted was a return to the simple joys of life, cherishing every memory, every moment, knowing the value of what she almost lost. Just as Jenny believed the nightmare was over, an unsettling feeling began to creep in. The victory, the light, the freeing of trapped souls, it had all seemed too easy. And as days passed, small, inexplicable occurrences hinted that the danger was far from over. The mirrors she had used in the confrontation began showing distorted reflections. At times, when Jenny would glance at her own reflection, she would see hollow, empty sockets where her eyes should be. Whispered conversations and laughter, eerily reminiscent of Eyeless Jack, echoed in her ears, especially during the silent nights. One evening, as Jenny was getting ready for bed, she saw a dark figure in her peripheral vision. Turning sharply, nothing was there, but the unmistakable feeling of being watched remained. The true realization came crashing down when she found a journal entry, written in her own handwriting, that she had no recollection of writing. "He's still here, watching, waiting. I thought I had won, but it was all part of his game. He's in my mind, in my memories, and he wants something from me." Panic set in. Was it possible that during their confrontation, instead of banishing him, she had inadvertently allowed him to latch onto her? One fateful night, the confrontation was inevitable. As Jenny lay in bed, paralyzed by fear, the temperature dropped. The weight of the atmosphere was suffocating. From the corner of her room, two hollow sockets appeared, gradually revealing the all-too-familiar form of Eyeless Jack. Instead of the aggression Jenny expected, he just stood there watching her with those eyeless sockets. Jenny felt a pull, an overwhelming urge to approach him. As she got closer, she could hear faint, distorted memories playing. Her childhood, her time with Emily, her recent confrontations with him, all intertwined. In a trance-like state, Jenny found herself standing face to face with Eyeless Jack. And then it happened. With an unexpected gentleness, he reached out, placing a cold hand over her eyes. When he removed his hand, Jenny's world went dark. She couldn't see, but she could feel. The depth of the abyss, the coldness of isolation, and the weight of countless souls, including her own, lost within Eyeless Jack. As dawn broke, Jenny's form lay still in her room, her face calm but eerily devoid of eyes. Eyeless Jack had claimed his prize, and in the end, he had won. Jenny's grandmother, heartbroken over the loss of her granddaughter, was the first to discover Jenny's lifeless form. The hollow sockets where Jenny's vibrant eyes once sparkled was a chilling sight that would haunt her forever. With the weight of grief and responsibility, she dived deep into the ancestral books that had been passed down through generations. There had to be a way, some method, to reverse the curse, or at least prevent it from taking more innocent souls. In her research, she stumbled upon a passage detailing the origin of Eyeless Jack. It was said that he was once a man, filled with rage and envy. In his quest for power, he traded his eyes, his soul's windows, to the shadows for the ability to control and consume others' memories and souls. Over time, he transformed from a man to the monstrous entity known as Eyeless Jack. Knowing the origin provided a sliver of hope. With this knowledge, Jenny's grandmother crafted a plan. If Eyeless Jack was born from darkness and despair, perhaps he could be weakened or even defeated by overwhelming light and hope. She began by gathering the townspeople. Sharing Jenny's story and the horrors of Eyeless Jack, she rallied them to come together. They decided to hold a festival, the Festival of Lights. Every home, every street was lit with lanterns and candles. Songs of hope were sung, stories of bravery shared, and as the night grew darker, the town glowed brighter. And it worked. For that night, no whispers were heard, no chilling breezes felt. The warmth and unity of the town seemed to hold the darkness at bay. Yet while the town celebrated, Jenny's grandmother undertook a private ritual. At its center was Jenny's lifeless form, surrounded by the brightest lanterns and protective symbols. The aim was not just to banish Eyeless Jack, but to retrieve Jenny's stolen eyes and the countless souls he had taken over the years. As the ritual peaked, a beam of blinding light shot into the sky, acting as a beacon. Slowly, orbs of light began to drift towards it, the souls that had been trapped by Eyeless Jack. As each soul merged with the beam, it grew brighter and more powerful. Suddenly, from the abyss, two orbs brighter than the rest emerged and gently settled into Jenny's hollow sockets. With a gasp, Jenny woke up, her eyes restored, filled with tears and gratitude. The next morning, as the town cleaned up from the festivities, life seemed to return to normal. The shadow of Eyeless Jack seemed to have retreated, at least for now. Jenny and her grandmother knew the fight wasn't over. They had won a battle, not the war. But with the legacy of knowledge, the power of unity, and the beacon of hope that the Festival of Lights provided, they were better prepared for whatever darkness lay ahead. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to watch this next video on 10 frightening creatures.